All right, we're gonna get started because I saw that Dr. Kitalong had many slides, so I want to leave him plenty of time as well as for questions. And so again, thank you all for joining us either in person or online. It's my pleasure to introduce not only my colleague, but my friend, Dr. Chris Kitalong, who came all the way from the Pacific island of Palau, and I'm sure he'll talk more about exactly where that is. But just real briefly, a little bit of background. So he grew up in the Pacific Island area, so Guam, Hawaii, traveled around in those regions. He has a bachelor's from Notre Dame in biosciences and business. He then went to Japan for a few years, where he has a PharmD as well, and then came back to the States, where he went to CUNY in New York City, where he has a master's and a PhD in biology and plant sciences. And so now he is back in his home country of Palau, where he is the Vice President of the Cooperative Research Extension at Palau Community College, which is in fact a US land grant institution. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Kitalong.
Do I just speak into the mic?
It's pretty good at picking things up.
Oh yeah, anyway, but I have to stand here and
You want people to see you stay there, but I would move around. Do
do what I want. Cheek it, yeah. So I gave sort of a part of this talk at the American Chemical Society upon invite by Dr. Lee, but it's looking at a full story. I guess I'll give you demographics as we go along. This is Ngorowid. It's the 70 islands in Palau. It's our conservation site. Sort of Palau's been known for conservation across the Pacific, and this is a traditional conservation site put together by the High Chief Ibadul, and then it transferred over to a legal no entry site. So it's an interesting sort of blend between the traditional and modern world, which is what this talk is going to kind of be about. Put it there. Oh, rolling. Well, there we go. So that's Palau. I can't move the map around, but it's the furthest away in the Pacific that you could get without hitting the Philippines or Japan. It's directly south of Japan and east of the Philippines and north of Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. And it's on the Kyushu Palau Ridge, and this is important mainly for geologists, but not so much for you guys. And this is how a traditional Palauan village would look. I say this now because we're moving from traditional mechanisms to modern scientific methods of staying healthy. And the normal way of living in Palau, everything was along a waterway. And the main source of protein was fish and seafood. I don't know if I talked about the size of the island. No, so I'll go back. How do I go back?
Here.
Okay, cool. So Palau is now 20,000 people. It's an island around 400 square kilometers, so it's tiny. But we've had a lot of visitors per se. So we'll go back. Our traditional way of living was, I don't mention it in here, but we did a linguistic studies during my doctorate looking at language and flow around the Pacific. And there's about 5 different introduction events of people, immigration, and then a period of of non-travel between the Micronesian islands. So it acts like a sort of Tower of Babel in the Pacific. We're really close together, but we all speak totally different languages. So when I went to high school, I couldn't understand. So we all used our English language to communicate, worked very well. So pre-Western trade, there's these money beads. If you've been in Palau, it's similar to the beads that they use in Indian culture, but it came from the Southeast. And it's very well documented. This trade across travelers taking trepang, it's a sea cucumber up through to China in the Pacific region, especially from Australia and the other areas, and they pass through Palau once in a while. And in the Western sighting, it was mainly the Southwest Islands, where you had sort of a religious incursion. And then there was a time where nobody went to Palau. It's very interesting because Guam, which is a neighboring island, wanted all the trade coming through there. So they told all the English and Spanish travelers that Palauans were cannibals. So they didn't head to Palau. They were really wary. So the English contact was by Captain Wilson. He accidentally ran aground on an island called Oolong. And immediately after landing, he fortified because he was worried they were going to get eaten. This is when the first Palauan Ibadul met him, and one of their princes, Libu, the namesake of somebody that we know, went to England and dispelled the rumors. So after that, there was much more trade. Spanish claimed the islands for Trepang, copra trade, and all those other fun things. And then Germany bought it afterwards because copra was a huge trade item prior to refrigeration because of palmitic acid content. When you cook bread with it, it stayed 2 or 3 days longer than normal bread. So that's why copra was king, per se, during the time. And the Pacific Islands and all the areas of copra were massive trade sites for the ships. And then after World War I, Japan came in and took over. And it was a massive influx. Around 40,000 Japanese at the time did a whole bunch of agriculture and mining throughout Palau. I say this because you have to understand how flow went and health. There was a war during World War II, Palau was one of the major battle sites because if you guys know, the atomic bomb launched from Tinian. It's an island in the Marianas Islands, and Palau was a major hub for Japanese during the Nanyo. So the Nanyo Empire is sort of the Pacific. It actually translates to Pacific Empire, and Palau was the capital. So they had to take Palau in order to launch the airplanes from Tinian to go bomb Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which were not the original targets. So there was a massive battle there. It was supposed to be 3 days because they said Palau was so small, it'd be easy. It went on for like around 6 months. So the whole island was razed, and a lot of the landscape was just devastated by napalm and a bunch of different attacks. I think there's a series, HBO Pacific. There's three episodes on it if you guys want to see the fun graphics. And then after the war, it was US trust territory times. Palau was sort of a trust territory under the US protectorate, and the rebuilding began, and the dependency began because most of our farms were destroyed, and a lot of the Palauans, including my father, got used to the military packs. So we started smoking when he was 11 because each pack came with a pack of cigarettes and chocolate. So that was the dependency on Western product because we couldn't get the farms back on operational. And then Western medicine, all that other fun stuff. So these are the demographic changes. Prior to European contact, the estimate was 20 to 50,000 Palauans. Actually, there's one study that shows 150. I'm more leaning towards that, but we're conservative, saying we didn't all die too quickly. All the way to pre-World War II, where we're down to 4,000. And after the war, they say there are around 3,000 Palauans left over. And we've grown really quickly, not really, but we've kind of stabilized around 20,000. And that's kind of going from all this disease management during Western, like smallpox, the same thing that most of the indigenous populations around the world experienced, and sexually transmitted diseases, a bunch of different causes of death, and then new medicine. And now we're dying of NCDs. So our transition of diet went from our traditional local food, which is taro. It's a root high in calcium, very tasty, right, Dr. Lee? And fish, to imported foods. So 85% of our foods are imported. There was sort of, the WHO had us group at Palau and all the Pacific Islands grouped in what they call the Westpac, which is the Western Pacific, which included us in the data for China, Japan, Korea. So diabetes and obesity were never a problem for our region. Our problem as a third world and developing country was food, just like the African nation. So they made sure we had enough food, mainly imported food. So Dr. Yano, who was my mentor, was Minister of Health at the time. So we pulled all the data out of the WHO databases and showed that of the top 25 to 30 countries, more than 50% are Pacific Islands and Caribbean islands. So it wasn't a first world disease. So they pulled that off. They pulled that proclamation saying it was an actual problem for the Pacific, and a regional sort of movement was made towards getting us healthy. And so I had one of our students, this was back in 2012, or my first high school student I had. We didn't have much science in Palau, so I had him run studies on imported products versus the increase in diabetes. Of course, there's a direct correlation, right? And then we started working with a group from Japan because they have very large backlogs of data of Palauan occupation and production. So they were looking at how what people consumed, and then they published an article showing that past techniques similar to almost every indigenous culture have been lost and translated over to Western style and diet. Therefore, we gain weight. And then we wanted to look at outliers because there's some strange indicator in these thrifty genes, as they call them, where we end up walking around with 400 to 500 parts per million glucose in our blood, which is a strange adaptation for feast and famine cultures. So we're usually hunting or fishing for 3 days, then we come back and have huge meals. So the body learns to store things better. So we want to look at outlier data, and we're working with a group in Switzerland to do brown and white adipose studies. But it's obvious HbA1c was average in Palau of the participants was high, so it was glucose. So these are these epigenetic and genetic factors that we're trying to look at and deal with, the feast and famine genes. During my father's time, it was still hunter and gatherer. He was kind of the first to go to westernized school systems, but still it was the taro and fish diet. And they introduced the military packs and imported products during the development times. And then, so in my studies, I was looking, because obviously I can't tell my father to go back to his original ways because, we tell him, oh, jump in a canoe or a bamboo raft. He goes, you jump in a canoe or bamboo raft. I did that my whole life to eat. You don't tell me what to do. But so we have to slowly show them that taking maybe a step back, not totally shifting, but integrating is a way to move forward in health. So we got together with a couple of groups and said, what is the search for health? So the first thing I tell my students, if you don't know something, look in the dictionary, right? If you don't know it, look in a dictionary, don't assume. So health is from the old word whole. So a person's mental, physical condition and the state of being free from illness. And I bring this up because I give this talk to the Palauans where we think health is at a hospital, or when you're sick, you go to a hospital. They think food is just something, and if you're sick, it's something you need to take a pill for, because that's what we've been trained in the new Western society. And then, so holism is looking at all parts. And then medicine is the treatment of the whole person. So medicine is the search for health per se. So all of these are derivatives, taking into account all factors. And so in the integrative approach to health, so integrate is to take parts and make a whole. So take all the different parts that you have to make you healthy per se. So major problems on the islands now, and probably in other places as well, because this is not just Palau, it's all across to French Polynesia, all the Pacific Islands and native tribes as well, is that everything is focused on symptoms-based treatment. So it's very difficult to address health needs prior, and end stage care is obviously more costly. And then a lot of it is that loss of cultural identity. When I ask my students, can you guys climb a coconut tree? And they're like, oh, we have a stick, or can we just buy the bottles from a store? So this is the gathering or the move away from this identity that you have, saying that you have to do something else because of an education structure, takes them away from that mode of the whole person, which is, I guess, an issue across the board, just cultural identities, trying to maintain that sort of globalized mentality, but understand where you're from and what genetic factors sort of come into play when you're looking at your health. So the problem, holistic approaches can help, as I said, not just focus on physical symptoms, but more prophylaxis. And then the cost, if we look at some of these local medicines, and that was my kind of goal in the beginning, looking at locally available things to address public health needs. And then, of course, loss of culture. If we're looking at the traditional medicines and put value in it, instead of the student staring at their phone saying, okay, I got to be a businessman or a politician, says, okay, maybe the knowledge that, because a lot of people come out to the islands and do their dissertation, studying for 3 months, becoming experts in fields. But this is knowledge that the students have in their heads from birth. And it can translate over to the Western style education easily, just like I did for my work. All my work was based on Palauan medicines. So all of my stuff compared Palauan medicines to Japanese and other medicines as well. So that gives them the identity back. Okay, then how do you bridge those gaps? So it's looking at scientific methods for proving traditional products are useful in modern day society. So the integration of Palauan traditional medicine, we've had our own, that's my grandmother on the right. Right. Yeah, and she's the one who would use these things practically. It wasn't something that was taught, it's something that was used. So we could see the practical application of these medicines. And then after that, we translated into a group collecting ethnographical data to develop some books. So we're reconnecting the youth with the elders to try to capture the information and show them that it's valuable and usable and economically viable. So this is the publication through 15 years of work. I'm looking at all the uses of plants. So we know that a lot of these interviews, the medicines are still being used and the knowledge is passed down by oral tradition. So we wanted to translate that oral tradition into a written mechanism because that's the way the modern youth is being taught. Maybe come up with an app later, see. So her again, she's cool. And during the initial study, we found that the majority of people remembered medicines. You know, these are the sort of things that stick in their head because when you're sick and you get something and get better, you usually remember it. And that's what we call like clinical trials in the past, thousands of years of clinical trials. And then these were some of the plants, because obviously we had to do the botany work. It's really fun. And the two of the major plants were mentioned, Premna and Filaria. We'll get more into that later. So we came up with a health manual. The idea with the Ministry of Health and the hospital was to develop a sort of college of health and a mechanism for people to use integrative approaches to health by knowing the traditional medicines. And here's a good example. So it shows the traditional medicines. It looks at what sort of plants and toxicology reports and things are related to it. Plus it also looks at the Western mechanism for treatment. So it becomes sort of a book that physicians can use in Palau, or we hope to have them use for integrative medicine degrees. That's why we work with University of Arizona Integrative Medicine School to try to get that licensure in so people can use that. So we get the knowledge and make sure they can use it practically in the hospitals. So went back looking, okay, these two initial plants that were mentioned most, the first one, Premna cerularifolia, was a topical treatment for wounds. And if you go to most areas in the world where you have a hunter and gatherer society, that's probably the most important thing. And then the other one was a metabolic treatment, energy tonic, immunity, Filaria, they call Ongai. So the other thing I want to look at is because obviously we moved out of our traditional places. So it's hard to find out if people in the past actually used the plant, except by asking questions. So what we did was look in the Rock Islands. So the Southern Lagoon was the oldest archaeological sites. So what I did was did ecological surveys throughout, randomized studies. I don't know if I put them here. A bunch of plots. It was huge and very fun to look at a randomized control of where plants were on the island or the distribution. And then what I did was I overlaid a map that we developed when we did the UNESCO World Heritage dossier submission to find out what plants were located where people lived. And of course you find Premna and Filaria only where people lived and not randomly distributed throughout the Rock Islands. So we know that they were using it before. So it shows that they're talking about it as the main use in medicine, plus the ancestors had it planted around where they lived and it wasn't elsewhere. So as I said, ethnomedical data increases likelihood of hits. And the question now is with disease models and us working on these things with our local physicians is, are people starting to use it more? So obviously this is the book I showed before. So what we try to do is a retrospective outcome study. So we looked at people who were suffering because obviously you saw the high rates of obesity and diabetes in Palau. So again, what's happening in the population today? Are people just using the Western medicine or are they still using traditional medicines? So we got a group of 200 high school students that called and interviewed all their family members asking what they used and if it was effective. It was very detailed. And we found out that Dalalagar was mentioned the most. So that name, Dalalagar, means mother of medicine. And the original name for Filaria is Ongat in our language. But it also doubles as Dalalagar because it's used in almost everything. So it's a sort of panacea in Palauan traditional medicine. So that's why it's named DAC, as you'll see. So we published that showing that people were still using it and they're finding it more effective. So it addressed our health concern and the ethnopharmacological data fit. So now I have to introduce you to filaria. This is the fun part. She introduced me to it, so now I introduced it to you. It's from the family Thymilaceae. So when you're going into, okay, the goal here is to come up with a product. So we are moving into clinical trials, but we have to know about the plant before we go to. So Thymilaceae is very well spread. And if you don't look at the family, you might not understand what the chemicals are. And this is the world of phytochemistry. Classes of compounds exist in certain plant species. So that's your first clue. So we know that from these studies, there's so many different uses for the family, but we also know that there's toxicity. It's a very toxic plant. Most of the US concern is that cattle doesn't get into the Mesoreum bushes because they end up dying of mucosal irritation. So we have to take that into account. Daphne esters. So we had two different Thymilaceae species in Palau. One is Wickstromia, the Bodvila, and Filaria, Ongayan. The Bodvil is used in the Polynesian area. This Wickstromia is used as a fish poison, where Filaria is only used for these metabolic disorders and some other things like bruise treatment and those. I'll get to it later. So this is something I did during my time in Japan. It was actually looking at hepatitis C, but it was a phytochemical sort of bio-guided fractionation to look at what kind of chemicals were in the plant, what classes. Of course, HCV wasn't a big issue, but when you go to a lab, sometimes you have to use whatever models they have. So it was a good way to get through and look at the chemistry. And we found that there were mainly benzophenones and xanthones in the extracts that you would use for the traditional treatment, which I'll get into further. So this was mangiferin, one of the, as you can see, a major compound. And there was a lot of uses for this, especially for metabolic disorders. So we did a quantification and sort of the variation in plant species across Palau, because when you're going to use a traditional medicine, not everybody uses the same plant. So you have to standardize your product. So we looked at the simplexins. These are diterpene esters versus mangiferin, which is supposed to be the active component. Because the simplexin and all these diterpene esters are actually toxic mucosal irritants. And if you ask the traditional people, they know if you didn't boil it right, because your throat gets itchy. And when ladies consume the leaves, you shouldn't talk about it, but it's an abortive fashion. They take it as a mechanism, and there's a process behind it and stages to do, but I try not to mention it with the Palauan youth. But these are astringent factors and diterpene esters that you have to remove in order to reduce the toxicity and allow for the treatment. So I said, okay, Palauans use this medicine for hundreds or thousands of years. So the traditional extraction method must remove these toxic compounds. So we did a publication on it. Can go through the methodology afterwards, but showing that the traditional method removed the daphne esters and the diterpene. So that's the first thing. When we want to give it to the population and use it as a treatment, we got to make sure it's not toxic. It's the same, an example would be kava. I don't know if you heard about the kava scare in Europe, where it's banned in Europe, because the kava extraction is, they use a method of pounding with water, but when they did a full organic extract, it was toxic because of some adducts. So now it's banned in Europe. So when you're looking at the development of a product, you got to make sure the toxicity is low and that they know that the methodology you use removes the toxicity or doesn't allow for toxicity. So in order to go to our clinical trial, which I'll hopefully get to sometime this century, we had to standardize certain leaf products from areas where we're going to do the collection. And we planted those at Dr. Yano's home and a couple other homes because we had to use that as our sort of standard. And we couldn't do tissue culture at the time. Hopefully we'll get that done this year. Extracted and did quantification of mangiferin, standard curve, all the fun chemistry stuff. You guys all know this, so I don't need to stay. And then looking at the different extraction methods, the methanol crude, you had multiple, obviously it's a whole extract, so you're getting a whole bunch of different compounds in there. Whereas, as you see at the bottom, the water extract, it's very focused. So obviously traditional people knew what they wanted from it, and they used the metabolic stimulant in the water extract. And for topical treatment, they used an oil extract. And for the other treatment, they consumed it directly. And these are the quantifications, which led, and then obviously we wanted to run beta cell trials on our own, just to look at sort of a metabolism of the product, because you're going to have your binding affinities, all that other fun stuff. So initially, when we had our first beta cell trials, you usually check within 60 minutes to 2 hours to 3 hours for beta cell stimulation, because those are normally how metformin and other glycerides work. But so they showed it and they said there was no activity, very low stimulation. So, Palauans drink this as a regular tea. So metabolism must be pretty quick. And I do have studies on mangiferin pharmacokinetics if you want to learn them, provide it. And it's usually a very quick binding and release and metabolism structure. So I had them do it within 15 to 60 minutes. And as you can see here, higher than the positive control. So this helped us develop our model for, and not toxic, as we all know already. Then we had this published somewhere with a glucose-dependent model. And so there were no difference in the plant types that we had. So we said, okay, we can use this stalk of leaves to develop the treatment and the therapy, because obviously this treatment grows on trees. So we could harvest at a regular pace, and we still do at the clinic today. So you can get all these magical things done, but this is how do we search for a cure? And for us, it was for diabetes and obesity. So we looked at the effectiveness. So now we had to move to creating the confidence between those two systems. So everybody who's been trained in the Western approach to medicine usually precludes sort of traditional practices, saying allopathic therapy is not necessarily where you need to be. So how do we reteach the physicians to use these traditional medicines? We have to, can we move on to that? Run it in the scientific way, run a randomized controlled trial so that we can publish something, and then they say they can't prove, or they can try to prove it wrong if they want, but they can run another clinical trial. So we had, we ran the clinical trials with two separate groups, the same way you run it. And then we used the methodology developed through the cell trial, saying that, okay, if the beta cell stimulation is from 50 minutes to 60 minutes, we want to provide it before they consume items. So we said that 30 minutes before consuming the sugar treatment, as we were giving it to them, you take the decoction. Also, there's mangiferin shows some activity in alpha glucosidase inhibition. I think I do need water. Let's try alpha glucosidase inhibition. So we wanted to allow that as well prior to the sugar introduction to see if that would reduce the uptake of sugar in the gut. So obviously you have to go through your IRB. So we went to the IRB, had a discussion, and our queen was a part of our IRB board. So she was pushing for us to get tradition in. But they said, okay, what's the mechanism? The typical Western style, what's the mechanism? Is it safe? We're worried about, pharmaceutical companies giving treatment for diabetes. They don't want you to die of the treatment. But if you die of the disease, it's fine because it's not their fault. So the first thing they do is ask, what about hypoglycemia? The question you have to ask in Palau, and it's kind of funny. We asked them, how many people in Palau have died of hypoglycemia in the past 5 years? 0. Okay, but obviously we have to do our due diligence, listen to them. So we ran our normal trials on ourselves. Of course, that's what every guy has to do. And we say, okay, we have no hypoglycemia. And then we ran the smaller trial, as you see up here, with 12 patients. It reduced blood sugar, and insulin secretion was a little bit higher. And then DPP-4 inhibition, which is the metabolism process of insulin, was decreased. So we said, okay, it's safe, move on. So we ran our randomized control trial. The first one was just mechanistic, looking at what options, make sure there's no hypoglycemia in normal patients, as well as some diabetic patients. And obviously we want to get it published so that they say, okay, this can be a valid therapy on the island. So we ran our clinical trial, and it was a 6-month randomized control crossover. And the weight decrease was average 2 to -4 or 5 pounds. HbA1c decreased, and it was pretty good for people. So we published it, they accepted it, and now it's covered by insurance in Palau. The product is covered by our national insurance, saying it's a therapy for diabetes. But you don't want to stop there. We want to do a follow-up. So what we did with the patients is that same production method in the leaves we made at the clinic. This is a small clinic in Palau run by one of my advisors, and we had it available to patients. So you could go get checked up and have this covered by your MSA. But we asked some of the patients, would you like to stay on? And we'll provide you the product and the testing for free. Because obviously it's our goal to help people. So 55 stayed on. Others didn't really want to come in. They actually started making it by themselves, which is the goal. Actually, the goal, they wanted to say, Chris, can you make a pill out of this? But no, that's not where we want to go, right? So a lot of them, we provided plants for them to take home and actually make on their own. And one thing in Palau is if you're at a traditional house, anything that's been there prior to the war, and most households are set, they have names. Every house has a filaria in it. It's like the basic thing to have around your home. So a lot of them just have to be reintroduced to the tree. So some of them went off on their own. Of course, they're doing all right. And a couple of them followed on. So 27, blah, blah, blah. And average HbA1, this is 2 years after clinical trial. Average decrease was around 2.49, which is pretty good. And BMI didn't really change. So this is why we're looking at that mechanistic approach between metabolism of storage between white and brown adipose in our next study. And most HbA1c changes were all good except for 2 patients that stayed on. BMI wasn't really that significant. HbA1c was good, dropped low. A lot of patients actually got off their Western medicine and are only on Long Island and exercise and therapy because we said BMI is not changing, so maybe we need to get more active. But one thing that we didn't expect was cholesterol lowering. So there was a significant lowering in cholesterol of the patients. So this is kind of hitting every component of metabolic disorder in Palau. So HbA1c's average of 2.3% drop. Some were as low as 6.1, and these were patients at 13, 14, 15, which is really high. And then significant weight loss wasn't observed, but significant lowering cholesterol was. So the conclusion, DAC has the ability to reduce those factors that lead to heart disease and sugar-driven diseases like kidney failure, all those other fun things. And BMI and waist circumference didn't really lower, so we're thinking about looking at other adjuvant therapies such as activities in the youth population and the young Palauan population to annex that. And then this is a model that we want to look at for the region to develop a positive control trials based on a traditional medicine and use them in the schools to teach science. So that's that. You can read. It's exactly what I said before. Yeah, but this is so the method that we're trying, this is obviously based on a Palauan panacea, but the idea is to use the model because it's inexpensive and people can use it in small islands and in their own tribes to try to maximize the use of their local resources, as opposed to being heavily dependent on, symptoms-based medicine, which is not, remember the integrative approach, as I said before, it's not discarding anything. It's using every asset that you have to be healthy and making sure you don't preclude something just because you're told to, including the placebo effect. So that's it. All thanks, everyone. And any questions? You recognize some people up there? So on the right, we have our president, his wife, some Native American lady who gave a great talk. And this is our queen, Ilung, our minister of tourism, our minister of education, Lebu. He's the son of the queen who's kind of been pushing this project ever since we're classmates. And then that's some strange guy on left with an aloha shirt at the match. Any questions after that boring?
So how is the tea made?
A tea is so we just, right now we have a sort of pressure cooker that keeps it closed, and we cook it for 30 to 45 minutes, usually on the higher end, 45, and then they put it into glasses. We're looking at a bottling possibility, but right now it's just outside the scope of most people's. People don't want to come up with a large scale production of it because people can make it themselves. So usually if I'm looking at if we want to do large scale production, it'll be large vat production with, what is it called? Sealing mechanism. Yeah, so it's just made and it's boiled for 45 minutes, the leaves, while immersed.
So you said you use a pressure cooker to prepare it for the clinical trial.
Yeah.
but do the general people use pressure cookers?
People, they just cook it over the stove. And honestly, the traditional method, if you say the lalakar in Palau, there's two different thoughts. There's people using the plant itself, and there's a combination treatment with two other plants, orai and it's just two other plants. So what we had to do is sort of use minimalistic approaches to see what the active component is, because the other ones are sort of diuretics. But in order to do this study, we want to focus on one plant. And if we want to do after, we can add a combination therapy. So they just boil it over and they actually leave it. A lot of times they'll leave the leaves in, cook it once, cook it again, and then cook it a couple more times and as a regular drink throughout the day. So it's like a green tea in Japanese culture, or kombucha, or else. How do we do that? Is there a calculation on dose? So the bioavailability of mangiferin itself was studied. I don't know, are they listening? Can they hear? So yeah, calculation on dose was looking at that chemical profile, as well as using the traditional method of counting. Some people use between 7 and 15 leaves. So we wanted to go on the lower end for the treatment mechanism. But the metabolism of mangiferin, it's taken up pretty quickly orally, and it's excreted pretty quickly. So bioavailability over 60 minutes is pretty in and out. Does that make sense? Is that what you wanted? So we use 7 leaves per se. It was around, I think it was 30 milligrams of dried plant to 1 liter of water, and let it boil off, because in the traditional method, the water actually boils off, so it concentrates it. And we want that stuff to boil off through, because that's those diterpene esters we're trying to get rid of.
So you didn't quantify after boiling to ensure that you actually had the same.
So that was that, that where we used all the different plants that we were doing, that last slide that showed the variations in extraction types. That's where we did the quantification. So we did different aliquots from each of the extractions, and then quantified it on HPLC PEA. So yeah.
Also a raise. Cindy wants to go ahead and jump in.
How do we do that? Don't unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for the really interesting presentation. I really appreciate you coming all this way to tell us about all of the work you've done. Very impressive. And I need to echo that taro is one of the most wonderful foods in the world. But I was curious if you did this study, any of these studies, alongside more or less traditional diets.
Yeah. Keep going.
I was just going to say, because having a westernized diet certainly could have a negative impact on so many health factors. So
yeah, so in the selection process, we were looking at people that were this is an adjuvant therapy study. So these were people that, we had to randomly select people. Obviously, Palau is not so big. So we had sort of inclusion and exclusion criteria. And a lot of it was patients that did not have sort of, with their metformin and glycerides or whatever treatment they were on, they were not able to manage their sugar levels. So it was an adjuvant therapy, but for the dietary constraints, it was a little bit difficult. We had the sort of the Geneva intent to treat. So we provided them with a product, and we asked them to we obviously provided diabetes 101, making them understand their numbers, because that was just the ethical thing to do. So that was kind of there. We couldn't really monitor. We were thinking about monitoring diet or sending them on a strict diet, but it was really expensive and it's really hard to monitor, especially some of these patients are your relatives and they tell you, like my father, I'm not going on a canoe. I'm going to eat what I want. So that was kind of the model. And we're looking at a larger scale clinical trial, probably elsewhere, because now a lot of Palauans are already on it. So it's difficult to have a clinical trial on patients that are already using it. But yeah, we're trying to look at maybe dietary constraints. But for the BMI and control, we're still working. We have a group called Wellness Rao or Palau Wellness, which is a group of health workers and Dr. Anna and myself that are integrating our approach to health into the hospital. So that also includes what the typical thing that Palauans get used to in other islands is no, don't do this, don't do that. The mode of approach is looking at what you can or what you can substitute things with. So you do your kitchen audits and things like that. And of course, integrating taro into diet is really important. That's on the CRE side of my work, is looking at this thing called Ser's Ed, where we're getting people back in to traditional farming, because it's difficult to go similar to, I sort of compare it to Cuba, where everyone was sort of set in the center and there were very few agriculture people because their main export was sugar, and then everything shut down. So most of the population didn't have that basic 101 skill of producing. So it's kind of happened in Palau. So we're trying to reintroduce that sort of dietary things like home gardening, sort of re-attending to your taro patches, because now a lot of the work is done by foreign laborers from Bangladesh, because they also have a taro culture. And a lot of the Palauans are doing their desk jobs and things like that. So they're not doing that sort of approach. And it doesn't take a long time, but they say, we're very busy. It's the busy mentality. I don't know if so taro, trying to get it back in, but it's usually used mainly during events now because the supply is not that high. So we're working on tissue culturing and reintroducing different techniques for growing it in Palau.
Great. Yeah, very complicated situation. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So I just had to read up on what happens with glucose and insulin and everything.
Yeah.
I couldn't quite remember. But so would you be able to clarify, like, does the tea work with like the glucose levels, or is it the insulin? Like, what is it?
So, usually insulin metabolizes, takes the sugar out and processes, right? So it's still like, it's a Western way of looking at it. The single approach, if you're saying beta cell stimulation, is it increases the insulin production. Therefore, a lot of times they're desensitized in some of these patients, so they don't have a lot of insulin flowing to the blood. So it's increasing that amount. But I looked at there's probably other mechanisms. That's why I looked at DPP-4 inhibition, because that's the process in the GLP that we kind of metabolizes and takes the insulin out. So that the idea here with the mechanism is that it allows more insulin in the blood and then doesn't take it out as quickly. So it can process the sugar in the blood. So metabolic processes. Is that right? Anybody have anything else to say about that? Could be wrong.
I have a question about the cholesterol, since that was surprising that you saw a decrease. So did you look at comorbidities of cardiovascular disease and any of these individuals?
So usually the exclusion criteria is not about to die, but a lot of them did have underlying conditions, and it's documented but there's a massive load of data. So we were looking mainly at those two things, BMI and HbA1c, but we measured almost everything. So the comorbidities, of course, for heart disease, they're all on that same line. So when we threw in NCDs and that came out, we're like, okay, great. But we didn't look at mechanisms of action on that. So I don't really, obviously I say if it works, keep doing it. If it doesn't hurt you. But yeah.
So you hinted at some archaeological studies.
Yeah.
I think looking at, if I understood correctly, it seemed like you were looking for evidence of these traditional medicines that have been used for long periods of time.
Yeah.
Did you find any that have been lost? Or maybe give me a little more.
Yeah. So, a lot of times everybody's like, okay, they come, and this is during OCOP. So a lot of my work was based on, of course, what my grandma told me, but then there's documentation of plant medicines during the Japanese, German, and not really Spanish occupation. So I reviewed those documents. And So I was sharing one of them, and one's written in Japanese, so my grandmother could read Japanese. So I showed it to her and said, "Oh man, that's your uncle. He was just joking with that guy." So, so they go to a household, and this is during colonial times. They say, "Okay, tell us about this plant, this plant," and this person just wants to get them out of their house. So they tell them, "Oh yeah, that one's good for elephantitis or something." And so I wanted to make sure that I looked at the old sites because she told me like our family is from the Rock Islands and nobody lives there anymore. So we can't really. The idea of looking at that was trying to say, okay, I know this might be a modern medicine brought from somewhere. So, because they might have found it, in the 40s or 30s, just like an example I use is the rhinoceros beetle, which is invasive. They say it's a problem. They say it came in the 50s. But when I asked the local Palauan population, say, no, that's been here ever since in the 20s, even before that. So the problem is setting these studies in a mode where you think that this is the answer, like they're using it now, but I wanted to see, okay, we did an assessment on filaria across the region, and it's really not good for anything. It's like the fire, like me, when I would stay on a rock island for a month, I want firewood, I need food, I need something that helps me with cuts and bruises and I can hunt with or eat. It fulfilled none of the other three, so it had to have been something that was medicinal. And there was no pollen, there was nothing eating the seeds. So that was really easy. So I said, okay, I'm gonna go and do these massive studies for no reason whatsoever. And then find out, okay, it was focused. Obviously, there was a purpose behind it, but I randomized it in order to find out what was just around and one that, like, I know you mentioned, if I found something that might have been lost, there's an endemic sort of cinnamon plant only based there too, which I might want to look at because in another island in Pohnpei, they use that a lot for fever. So that might be one thing. It's a Horsfieldia palauensis, as you can tell by the species, it's endemic. So that was one thing that we might look at down the road for fevers. But that was the purpose of because everybody's living here and we don't know what people were planting during their house development. But since nobody lived there, I could go around. So I took Naomi to one of those marine lakes. And what happened during the times of bad weather was they would put fish in these marine lakes and the whole population lived around those lakes. So they don't live there anymore. So when you go back, we already know kind of where they were, but we obviously have to do the Western scientific method of documenting archaeological sites. So we had that, and I used that layer on top of my transects to kind of find out what was only where people lived, and there was those two plants. Does that make sense?
Are there any other questions or anyone online that you can hear?
Hi, I have a quick question. This is Michelle. Thank you. That was really awesome. So my question is about, well, one, I want to say it's really great that you stuck to the traditional preparation and delivery and the cooking and I guess the administration of this medicine. And so that's great. I love that. So now my next question is about protection of that. So it's a traditional remedy, right? And you have demonstrated some efficacy in bringing down cholesterol and A1C. So how do you protect that where does that knowledge belong? Is there a mechanism that you have in place to protect that knowledge and preserve it for the people in your community? Or I don't know, is the question coming through clear? My concern is, oh dear, protect all of that knowledge and all of that practice because it's just really sacred for one, and it's effective. And it belongs to the people in your community there. So thank you. Great presentation.
So IP, so we're talking about intellectual property. I guess you could give the idea is also obviously protecting something, but my main goal is that it's not made somewhere else and sold back to us. But we do want it to be used. If something helps people, we want to make sure it gets out there. So there's that balance. An example would be taro, and people were mentioning taro. there was a blight that affected all the taro of Polynesia and Southeast Asia. And Palau had a variant that was resistant to this blight. So we shared that, variant with a Polynesian, actually it started at UH, University of Hawaii, and they wanted to patent it and then sell it to the people. And our Minister of State at the time said, no, this was a gift to our Pacific brothers for food. So it's given free, open access to this thing because it helps, it provides food, it keeps us healthy. And we're not gonna make anything proprietary that can help our brothers and sisters. That's one thing, but I understand that obviously with Big Pharma, as it was, Big Pharma started great. You know, they were the guys who started them were great, but now the mechanisms are different for patenting things. So developing patents and intellectual property for traditional knowledge is a difficult process, and it's relatively new. So I spent some time working with WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, looking at mechanisms to protect traditional knowledge and put it as a form of inventorship. Because under WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, everything that is TK is considered to have prior art, therefore inventorship. Therefore, it can be sort of not patented without providing access and benefit sharing, which is part of the Nagoya Protocol, which we wrote the law for and just ratified in Palau last year to make sure that we're linked with the rest of the international groups, because we're not a member of the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization. If you were, then you'd be protected under WIPO. So this was another year of work with the UN, coming up with a draft law, making TK a form of inventorship, but also putting access and benefit sharing and genetic rights under the Nagoya Protocol as a mechanism for protecting Palauan traditional knowledge. And when we launched that first medicinal book, we launched it at the UN, and I had the director of WIPO there, and we deposited it as prior art for Palauan traditional knowledge. I don't know if is that clear?
Yes, that was exactly, yeah, you've done the extensive work to go forward with the protection. So that's great. Thank you.
But we also want to make sure we promote expression.
Mhm.
So the initial TK law that was trying to assign rights for certain knowledge to people, but what we want to make sure that we do is we study it, and maybe, of course, if there's economic benefit, it's shared with the island, but we do want to spread benefit to people. So there's always that balance. And of course, I'm working on some patents, but.
Very nice, thanks.
Any other questions? Oh. You might have said this and I just missed it, but did they use this tea for the same purpose in the past?
That's important. That's a good question, because obviously my father never had a problem with this. So that's why that's where the IP is. It's used for something else. So we're trying to make sure that's protected, but it was used as an energy tonic, because obviously we didn't really have to worry about getting obese unless we're from very wealthy clans. And even then,
can you explain what energy tonic means?
oh, it just makes you wake up. Yeah, metabolic stim. When we were fishing for a long time, they would drink this with ginger or coconut oil and, wake up and go fish. Because when you ask them, like, they're just going to say it's, I say, like it runs your blood. So like it flushed the system too. So obviously those are metabolic processes. So when they wrote those down, I say, okay, metabolic disorders are the problem. So this is something used as a metabolic stimulant. So therefore it maybe becomes an analog for treatment of current diseases, which came very recently. So using the mechanism that we had that our bodies were used to in order to act as sort of an adjuvant therapy to the change in lifestyle. So the diet shift is very difficult. It's just taste. Like Palauan, since the Japanese times, we like rice, as like the Pacific Islands, and it's just the storage mechanisms for that for us is very bad. So a lot of these processed foods, I can't switch them over completely, but there can be sort of a shift and change, and then that added benefit or add that adjuvant therapy to allow for it to be processed, because we're kind of a step back in that sort of genetic feast and famine gene. So we have to add, the idea here is adding something that can allow for that transition to be more smooth, and that we don't die at age 58, which is the average life expectancy for a male in Palau now. So I got a couple of years left. Is that okay? Does it have caffeine? What does the tea taste like? You had some at Robbie's house, right? Yeah, it's not, yeah, it's a very mild taste. I've had this in Japan and with some Chinese, Korean, and a bunch of Asians. They say it's a mild sort of kocha sort of taste. It's like it's because if you dry the leaves, which we do now, it becomes a more brown coloration. The fresh leaves is a little greenish brown, and it tastes a little bit more like a zing, I would say. These are tea, you have to ask a tea expert, but they say it's a little bit similar to a soft kocha. So that the branches of the tea tree when you cook them. Is that no caffeine? Is that it?
Okay, thank you for coming all the way from Palau.
Just for this.
No, I'm not here. All right, thanks everybody for joining us.
If you want to contact any questions about mechanisms,
Yeah.
just email Dr. Lee.
Yes, he has plenty. If you want to learn more about the actual chemistry extraction, he had all those. And this is recorded. I don't know, are we going to put it on the website? All right. All right. Thank you, everybody.